Hey friends, hope everyone's doing good. Welcome to the new first Wednesday, the way it's going to roll, at least for this month, and then we'll see how things go in the future. So, a little bit about our background here. Some of you guys are plugging in that haven't been a part of this before. I'm just going to be really casual about it. Kind of the video here. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've been. So what we've been doing at First Wednesdays is we've been dealing with biblical spirituality, which is what I'm getting my PhD in. So it's an interest of mine, and we've been dealing with the question: what is biblical spirituality? What does it mean for us? How does it all work? Is it the same as sanctification? If you've been a part of these First Wednesdays, you've been hearing these things. So I'm going to review a little bit. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to review a little bit for those of you that may be tuning in since we're putting this online for the first time. I'm going to review a little bit about where we've been, what spirituality is, what biblical spirituality is, kind of talk to you about how we've structured it and sort of get you up to speed on everything. And then we're going to dive into what we're going to deal with today. And then at the very end, what I'm going to do this week, I haven't done this in past weeks. We did a little bit last time, the last section of this. I'm going to give us some action items for it. I'm going to give us something kind of cool to do with all of this as we lead up to Easter. So this is what we're going to do. Biblical spirituality. What is biblical spirituality? When you hear about spirituality, that's really kind of been a common thing. There's really been a heightened interest in this over the last few years. There's a lot of different things in spirituality. A lot of times when we think about spirituality, I've been telling folks that you think about maybe going to sit in a room and get rocks put on you, or you think about meditating, or going to do hot yoga, or you hear people talk all the time about it now, like, I don't like his energy, or he has bad energy, or I can just feel his energy. So there's really kind of this movement back towards this. One of the things that's interesting, particularly about younger folks in America now, you may or may not realize this, but there's been an increased interest in this higher being, these higher powers, which is kind of a good shift for Christianity, because in Bible times, everybody really did. If you think about the Greco-Roman culture in the New Testament that we deal with as sort of the backdrop to all of the letters of the Apostle Paul's and the time of Jesus that lived, there was just this innate understanding that there were higher powers, there were gods, there were these things beyond us. That was sort of just a fabric of society. And then we went through this sort of period in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century that came from Europe, the Enlightenment period, where things became real rational. You all remember this if you've been around a while. I've paid attention to it. And that kind of shifts into it was called the Enlightenment. That kind of shifts into more rationality. That's where atheism comes from. All that sort of comes out of it. The secular age. I think there's a book right there by Charles Taylor. I don't know if you can see that. The secular age really defines kind of the world we've been living in. So things have begun to move back. In some ways, there's been a little bit of a shift to this sort of idea of a higher power. There's a higher being out there. But what comes with that is an understanding of spirituality. What is spirituality? What does it mean? How does it function? All of these sorts of things. What we want to do with that is we want to talk. I'm going to give you a definition of spirituality if you're writing this down. I usually have a whiteboard, so we're not quite that high tech yet. So you're going to have to be listening to learn today. But spirituality in general, when we talk about spirituality, the way that I've defined it, I get this from a combination of different things. I read a lot of material on this, but when we define spirituality, we're mainly talking about your interaction with the divine. That's spirituality. So to be involved in some type of spirituality, you've got to believe in something divine, something higher, and then there's some way that you interact with that. That's what I mean about you. There's a lot of things out there nowadays where there's this higher power and people interact with it some ways. Again, you might go sit in a room and do hot yoga, whatever. There's just a lot going on. You may drink a certain tea with this candle lit and you can feel this energy. I don't know. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff out there nowadays. But what we, particularly as Christians, as Orthodox Bible-believing Christians, we believe in a particular type of spirituality, a biblical spirituality. Spirituality is something that's inherently Christian. Not only is it inherently Christian, but we believe that the Bible speaks of this term. But the Bible actually defines what spirituality is. So you deal with this all the time in your world. There's these things that are inherently Christian. Spirituality, I would argue that spirituality, interaction with the divine, that is actually a Christian, an Orthodox Christian thing. And that concept, this happens with lots of things. That concept is people will take Christian concepts and export them and use them in their own way. We've probably mentioned this before, but I had a professor in college, in seminary, that was doing a work on different colors. He was writing a book on colors. You know, what is red and black? How do those colors? What do they look like in society now? And just was kind of talking about how does society uses colors and all these sorts of things. But he brought up an interesting point, and I think I probably mentioned this before. He's like talked about, you know, the rainbow. He's like, as Christians, we've lost the meaning of the rainbow. The rainbow is an inherently biblical thing, right? I mean, that's, other than visually seeing it, we know that there's a real biblical narrative that's attached to the rainbow, right? You learn about this as a kid. Well, that imagery is exported to something wholly different. That's what happens with spirituality in some ways, but spirituality is a biblical thing, interaction divine. Biblical spirituality is a Christian relationship with God through the person of Jesus Christ. That's what makes you Christian. It's a relationship with God, a relationship with the divine being God, the triune God. We have that relationship through Jesus Christ by way of the Holy Spirit. That's essentially what spirituality is. The question that always comes up with spirituality is it sanctification? Is it growth in godliness? Is that what spirituality is? And I would argue that sanctification is a part of spirituality. And the reason that I argue that is because spirituality isn't just individual, right? So sanctification is more of an individualized thing. I've been telling our folks on First Wednesdays that the Reformation, what people don't realize about the Reformation, if you don't know this, but back in the 1500s, when the church split, the Protestant and Reformation happened, and the church split out of Catholicism. There was a lot going on in all of it, but really at the end of the day, one of the biggest issues in all of it was they were personalizing the Christian faith, the Protestant Reformation. And so sanctification was a big thing that came out of that, this personal holiness growth. And that's a part of spirituality, but spirituality is more broad. Your relationship with God is individual. So we want to think of spirituality as your relationship with the divine, your relationship with God through Jesus Christ by the Spirit. That's sanctification. But it's a broader picture. It's a holistic approach to Christianity. Is sanctification, but spirituality occurs in the sense of worship. Worship is a part of spirituality. That's done congregationally, right? Most of the times when you worship, you may do that as a family, but a lot of times you're going to do that congregationally. Worship's a part of it. Scripture reading in church on Sunday. I mean, all of these things form your spirituality. I would argue that evangelism is a part of your spirituality. I would argue that social activism is a part of your spirituality. It's grounded in Christianity. It's formed by theology. It's how you interact with God, right? But it's beyond just your personal pray sanctification. These really one lane thing. So that's sort of the gist of all of this. So if you've been a part of this or you haven't, I've drawn out sort of this scale of what spirituality looks like, and I've broke it into 3 parts. Spirituality is your head, your heart, and your hands. Very simply, the way you interact with God, the divine, that happens by way of your head, by way of your heart, and by way of your hands and feet, your actions. All 3 of those things, individually and corporately, they make up spirituality. That's kind of a rough outline of it. The way that I've been working with this is that based upon some work by another gentleman named McGrath, by Alistair McGrath, I believe that he's right in this, but there's really 4 broad factors to spirituality. If you think about your relationship with God, how do you commune, or how are you in relationship with the divine person through Jesus Christ? There's 3 factors to that relationship, broad factors that I've been walking through with the church on Wednesday night. The first one is your attitude towards the world or the culture. So if you weren't a part of it, there's different ways that we interact with culture as Christians. There's different philosophies on how throughout history, even currently, of how the church engages with culture. What does that look like? Are we even to engage? Do we withdraw? How far do we get in? It's that tension in your life that you're of the culture, you're in the culture, but you're not of the culture. You're not fully contextualized to the culture. And so if you didn't realize this, all the way through Christianity, there's been differences of opinion on how that goes. That's one factor of your spirituality. Another factor that factors into your spirituality, we're thinking at 60,000 feet here, what affects your divine relationship with God? The way you interact with the culture is a big part of that. A second consideration that we did last month in March that I unfolded for you guys was denominational considerations. It matters what denomination you're in. A Catholic spirituality is much different than a Protestant spirituality. And then in the Protestant umbrella, a Anglican spirituality is much different than a Pentecostal spirituality. A Baptist spirituality is sort of down the road. Baptist is sort of down the road, but you have a Reformed end of things. You have a more Pentecostal charismatic that I mentioned before. And all of those spiritualities, the way those churches, the way these denominations interact with the divine, it varies a little bit. There's a lot of crossover in Protestantism. I mean, you begin to really start splitting hairs on things. And for theological nerds like me, it matters in some ways, but across the board, I have more in common. My spirituality has more in common with a Pentecostal than it doesn't. So there's not a ton of in there, but it does matter. It does matter. What do you think about the Lord's Supper? All of these things that factor into your relationship with the divine. Lord's Supper, baptism. How do you unfold your worship? What type of preaching do you do? It may not be wrong. It may not be unorthodox or heretical, but it does have an influence on how you interact with the divine. And those are convictions on it. So your attitude to the culture is one. That's a factor in your spirituality. Your denomination factors into your spirituality. It factors into your relationship with the divine. And then the thing that we're going to address today is personal issues. And what I mean by that is each one of us as individuals in this world, in this big, huge world, there are issues with us. There are issues surrounding us that shape your spirituality. There are things like coronavirus that we're going through right now, right? Coronavirus is something we're dealing with. It's a personal issue to a lot of us. It's affecting the globe, but in general, that is some sort of force in your life that's shaping your relationship with the divine. You may, I don't know, take this for instance. We are worshiping on Sunday morning via video. That is a different type of relationship with the divine. That's a different, so worship shapes your relationship with the divine, shapes your relationship with God. Doing that in your pajamas while you stare at me in front of my bookshelf in my living room is it's a little bit different, right? So those are personal influence on you, but we're going to think carefully about that this evening, and there are going to be different layers of personality. I want you to think clearly about this, because ultimately I'm trying to be helpful to you, because this stuff is helpful to me as well. And how it shapes my life, how it shapes my approach to Christianity. So this is part of it today. Personal issues. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to map out for us, and if you are following along and you're studious, you should try to take some notes on this. I'm going to give you 6 things that I think factor into the personal issues. Personal issues are just one of 4 factors that affect your spirituality. Under the banner of personal issues, we're gonna talk about 6 things here. I got 6 things for us that I want to talk about to give us clarity on it. I'm just gonna try to frame how you should think about personal issues and how these personal issues affect your spirituality. It affects your relationship with the divine. And then at the end, we're going to do a little bit of application. Really what these are, really what teaching is in some ways, particularly for you guys, it's not academic high up here. What I'm trying to do in all of this, a lot of times when teaching is much different than preaching, but in terms of teaching right here, what I'm trying to do is just give you a framework of how to think about things. So teaching is in some ways, just trying to give you this framework to say, Here are the factors involved in it, and then we're going to try to figure out what to do with that. So there's going to be goals in all this. So personal issues. What are the personal things that affect your spirituality? You could probably think of some. These are 6 that I jotted down that I've personally thought through, tried to deal with. So this is it. There's personal issues. So there are these real life circumstances. Number 1 is just real life circumstances. Your real life circumstances, they affect you. They affect your relationship with the divine. You know this. Like if you're mourning the loss of a family member, that's going to affect your relationship with God, right? If you're in a financial hardship, that has an impact. Whether you realize it or not, that has an impact with you and God. It shapes the way you pray. It shapes the way you worship. It shapes the way it may give you an understanding or a grace with people that are going through that. Sometimes God uses your own hardships to shape the way so you can help people, right? You know, you've been there, done that. That's one thing. Getting married, if you're getting married or you recently got married, if you're wherever you're at in that stage in there, that affects your relationship with the divine. There's a lot of ways that it does that in there, but you pray differently. You think differently about things. You may approach God differently with things if you're in the middle of getting married. Maybe you just, I wrote this down, maybe you just welcomed your first grandchild, or maybe you've welcomed your first grandchild. That shapes your, that's a personal circumstance. That shapes your relationship with the divine. You may begin to start praying for a grandchild. You may wake up, I've got friends that I know that wake up every day and they pray for their grandchildren based upon certain things in their lives. So those are things that come at you, all these. But all of these things, they affect your relationship with God. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Coronavirus, big thing. We could go on and on and on and on about what it is that these things are, how they affect us, why they affect us, all these sorts of things. So what I want you to see in that is that's number 1. What are personal issues that affect my relationship with God? Number 1 is your individual circumstances, individual life circumstances. Number 2 is your historical context. You may or may not realize this, but every point in history, people approach God differently based upon their historical context. What I mean by that is I've done a good bit of research on the history of the particular Baptist in Charleston, South Carolina that came out of First Baptist Charleston. I've talked about these people before, Richard Furman, Oliver Hart, these guys. They ministered in Charleston during the American Revolution. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine ministering in downtown Charleston when literally, Sullivan's Island is under attack? I mean, these battles happen, and I've read their diaries. It's fascinating. I read the diaries of these men through those battles, and so that circumstance affected them. It affected their relationship with the divine. I read a gentleman's journal, and I've probably told this before, but it's like he has a journal entry on one day where he's praying for his sick daughter who has a fever, and then the next day he says something to the effect of, the enemy at Sullivan's Island, speaking of the British, have been defeated. Thanks be to God for his favor upon us. So, I mean, that I've never prayed. I don't know about you, but I've never prayed to God and thanked him for the British being defeated at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. So the point I'm making in all that is that your historical context, it affects your spirituality. It affects how you live in relationship to God, the way you pray, what is important to you, doctrines, history, your situation, heighten doctrines, right? We're talking about the doctrines of God right now in church. And that is based upon our historical context in coronavirus. So if someone was to look back over the history at Grace on the Ashley one day and saw that there was this dude named Brett Stokes that was in the middle of this thing called coronavirus, and he was to read some of these blogs I've been putting out, he may be thinking, why is he doing this? Well, it's his context. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so it's affecting my relationship with God and how I approach it. This has happened a lot. Puritans, these old dead guys I talk about all the time. 16th, 17th century England, very persecuted people. They were in the midst of persecution and suffering. And so when you're in the midst of suffering, that has a major effect on the doctrines that you find important. That has a major effect on what scriptures you migrate to, how you do church, all of these things. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So personal circumstances, your historical context. Your historical context is a big one. Another example of that too, historical context, I like history so I get to talk about, is the Reformation. When these guys like Zwingli and Calvin and Luther and all of these guys that came and split out of the Catholic Church, if you read these guys, they're pretty hostile towards the Catholic Church. A lot of their writing is just beating the drum against the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church now is a much different church than it was then. You need to understand that. But you read this stuff and you can tell that there are certain theological issues that were, it was like, I'll die over this. And I'm reading it and I'm going, I don't think I'm dying over this issue. And it's because we live in a different context, and that affects your relationship with God. So personal circumstances and historical context, major factors in your spirituality. They're personal issues. They're under this bucket, personal issues, and they factor into the divine relationship in your life. I wish I could do questions. Maybe we'll do this differently at some point in time. But here's number 3. Gender, class, and race. Gender, class, and race. These things affect your relationship with the divine. It does. These are personal issues. We, as a church, we still affirm gender differences. There are differences between men and women. This will get you in all kinds of trouble nowadays, but men and women react to things differently. They process things differently. They're just different creatures. They just really are. And if you if you don't believe me, you get married, and you'll know what I'm talking about. You'll realize really quickly that I don't know if I fully understand her, you know what I'm saying? And so there's major differences between gender. And so your relationship with God is processed differently. One of the things, for example, this is fascinating to think about, but I see it as a pastor. Do you know that women and men typically struggle with different types of sin, much different types of sin? There's just dispositions in men that cause them problems that women just don't have. And so that's why we do life-on-life discipleship. We try to do it based on gender, even though that's not really, that'll get you in trouble out in the world today. But we do that because men struggle a lot of times with the same things, the same type of sins and tensions and stuff, and women do the same thing. And so it's very helpful. It's beautiful the way God's unfolded with that. But that's gender. It has a major implication on your relationship with the divine. How about this? Churches all over the world. If you've done mission, we just had a group come back from Ethiopia. They went to, was involved in the church there in Ethiopia. Much different worship styles, much different type of spirituality in Ethiopia than there is in Charleston, South Carolina. Hopefully in the days ahead you'll be able to hear from these guys and maybe understand a little bit about what those differences are. So that's kind of the way it is. Even your class, even where you are socioeconomically, it makes a difference. It's Charleston, South Carolina, much different socioeconomic class than Ethiopia. If you don't believe me, talk to the guys that went there. Much different. And that all impacts your relationship with the divine. It impacts it impacts how you worship. It impacts what you value. It may be good. It would have been great to have those guys talk about that. So hopefully when we hear from that team in Ethiopia, they'll begin. I think that's one of the beautiful things about missions, is that it sends you into this space to realize, like, man, we don't have all the answers. And maybe even further, here's what's beautiful about, and I think the folks that went to Ethiopia would tell you this, is that sometimes they value things that we probably should value. And all of these things factor in it. I'm just trying to give you the big broad. So gender, class, race, that's a personal issue that affects your relationship. Historical context, and your personal circumstances. Here's number 4, learning differences. You may or may not know this, but a major part of discipleship, a major part of growing in your relationship with the divine is knowledge. So we believe, take sanctification, growth in holiness. I believe that biblically it begins with the mind and it goes into the heart. Your heart can't be inflamed for anything your mind doesn't know. So knowledge, this was in Philippians. We talked about this a little bit. And God willing, if we get through what we're in right now, there's more of this coming in the latter chapters of Philippians. But Paul talks about in that book a lot about knowing God, growing in knowledge of God. So learning is a major part of discipleship, I'm convinced of that. a deep understanding. You cannot love something you don't know. And I think one of the hallmarks of true Christians that are really pursuing God is they have a desire to know Him. But that looks differently for some of us, right? I mean, I don't take any offense to it. I love to read, but I have a lot of people I really respect. They're not huge fans of reading. I mean, they're not going to read much of anything you give them. They're just not. They're more visual learners. They're more hands-on. That's just the way they're bent. So there's different learning styles in all of it, and they need to see it. Some of you are going to struggle with this video because I don't have any visuals for you. Maybe we'll enhance if this thing goes on, but you want to see it. You want to be able to see, like, Britt, give me some kind of diagram. Show me what we're doing. You're more of a visual learner. Most of us are. Very rarely do you run into someone just open a book, intake all the information, and just be able to go with it. So that has a big part of it. Memorization, huge part of your spirituality. I've been trying to memorize some verses in Colossians the last couple weeks. I think the first chapter of Colossians is just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful scripture, particularly about Jesus. And I've been trying to memorize some scripture in that. I think that's a major part of your spirituality. Scripture memorization is a major part of your relationship with the divine. And so I want that to be a part of your life. That's number 4. Number 5, how about this? Your body and your mind. Do you realize that your body, your health, your mind, mental, physical health is a major part of your spirituality? I've always thought about teaching a class, theology of the body, and pair it with some kind of exercise or nutrition program. I think it'd be really cool. I think God's concerned about the body. I think He's concerned about health. I know that some of you out there are rolling your eyes and like, here's this millennial. He's probably eating kale chips and drinking tap water for dinner and stuff. But I'm serious. I mean, I'm convinced of this. And this is not just because I'm a millennial. I'm gonna prove that to you in a minute, but your mind and body, your sickness, your health, what you intake, those things matter. They matter to God. They matter to God. There's an old dead guy, Jonathan Edwards. I put him in a blog that's already up, and it's going to come out in the newsletter again tomorrow for some of you. But I quoted a guy in there, Jonathan Edwards. He was really the greatest theologian that America's ever produced, in my opinion. But when Edwards was converted, he was 18, 19 years old. He wrote 70 resolutions. You can read them. You can show them to you. I don't think I have them over here. I would show them to you in his publication. But anyway, he wrote 70 resolutions about his life. They're really phenomenal. They cover all kinds of things. They cover time management, relationships, suffering, character, prayer. I mean, and they're hardcore. If you read them, you're thinking, man, I'm a slouch. You read these and you're like, this is a 19-year-old guy who was really committed to God. And God did some really incredible things with him. He's really a model of what spirituality should look like, in my opinion. But these resolutions, they're about all sorts of things. You know, how he was going to spend his life in prayer, how he was going to manage his time. But listen to resolution number 40 here. This is fascinating. This is resolution number 40. This guy lived in the 1700s, okay? This guy was not a millennial. So listen to this. Resolution number 40. This is the direct quote, resolved. So he would say resolution number 40, and he would say resolved, and then he would write the resolution. And he if you knew him, he was an extremely disciplined man. Resolution number 40, open quote, resolved to inquire every night before I go to bed whether I have acted in the best way I possibly could with respect to eating and drinking. Let me read this again. Resolved to inquire every night before I go to bed whether I have acted in the best way I possibly could with respect to eating and drinking. And he dated it January 7th, 1723. Can you believe that? This is a guy that understood that his relationship with the divine was shaped by what he put in his body. And he made a resolution about it. And what I know about this guy, I bet he followed it. I'd be shocked if he didn't follow it. How many 18-year-olds do you know that have sat down to make 70 resolutions about how they're going to interact with the divine for the balance of their life? They're beautiful. You should go check them out. The resolutions by Jonathan Edwards. And then the final thing before we get into a little bit of what I want you to do over the next week, is the final thing that is a personal issue that affects your relationship with the divine is your goals in life. Did you realize that your goals, whatever the benchmarks you place for yourself in your life, and I believe that all of us have some kind of goals. You may not have them written out, but just kind of mentally in the back of your head in some way, you probably have something that you, and it's not unhealthy. I don't think goals are bad. I'm going to talk about that later on. Something that you desire, something that you seek after, somewhere you would like to get, just something out there in front of you. And if you don't, I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to, wherever you're at in life, I'm talking 15, 80, wherever you are in life, put something out in front of you. Put something out there in front of you. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But your goals in life, they reflect your relationship with God. They really do. If you're a student, think about this. If you're a student, you have a goal in front of you. That affects your relationship with God. It affects what you pray to God about, how you pray Him, what you're worshiping. It affects, you spend a lot of times, younger people will spend a lot of time trying to discern God's will for their life. What's God's will? Those types of things. That affects your relationship. Are you trying to raise God-fearing children? Is that a goal of yours? That affects your relationship with the divine. It affects your struggles. It affects when you pray to Him, how you pray with Him. Busy moms, you got a lot of kids. Listen, you got kids. It's probably you're probably not waking up. If you got 4 kids, you're probably not waking up at 4 a.m. to do Bible studies alone. You might be, and if you are, that's great. But I'm just saying, you have to. You may on the commute to work every day, or in nap, or there may be just these small windows in your life. If you're a mom and you've got kids and you're just busy, there's maybe just these small windows in your day where you get a little bit of alone time and you can pray. You may not have the luxury of a single 19-year-old that can wake up and for hours sit and read theology and just all of this stuff. That's a reality for you. That affects your relationship, right? That affects your relationship with the divine. But that's a goal of yours. You're trying to raise good children, and so that affects your time. And then, there's a lot of things: job promotions, retirement, all of these sorts of things out there. And so these 6 things, I'm going to go through them again because I want you to write them down. Your personal situation, your individual circumstances, where you at in life, what's going on around you that's affecting you, your historical context. Most of you, Charleston 2020, what does that mean for you? If you live in the low country of South Carolina in 2020, what historical context does that put you in? That's going to affect it. Your president, where's the country at? All these sorts of things, that's historical context. The third thing is your gender, your class, and your race. That's a third aspect that is going to affect your relationship with God. And I'm giving these to you because I want you to think about them. You should think about what I'm going to give us at the end is I want you to reflect on these things and determine how they're influencing your relationship with the divine. The fourth thing, your learning differences. You should know what kind of learner you are, because it's a big part of discipleship. How do I learn? What's the best situation for me? How's my differences in that? That's the fourth one. The fifth one is your body, your mind, your health, your psychological, mental, physical health. Major part of your relationship with God. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you Jonathan Edwards? Are you every night inquiring whether you have acted in the best way possible before God with respect to what you eat and drink? And then number 6, your goals in life. That's the 6th thing, is that your goals in life, what are they and how are they affecting your relationship with the divine? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do something a little bit different. I haven't given quite this application before on these videos, but or on these teachings before. But what we're going to do is from today, if you're watching this and you want to be a part of it, I know that you're watching Seinfeld or Netflix or something. I know you're wasting some time somewhere because all of you are not working at home the way you ought to be. I don't believe it for 1 minute. But between today and next Wednesday, so look forward to hearing about our Easter plans. We're going to begin more than likely to launch off into what we're going to do for Easter at the end of next week. So hang on. There's more information coming about that. But from today until next Wednesday, which will be like a mini Lent, okay? We don't celebrate Lent, but there's just a mini time in there. I want you to utilize this time well. We've talked about be the people of God, let God use this stuff for your good. And so we're Christians. The way that I look at it is this. I know I'm getting sidetracked, but as a Christian, you kind of live like this, with your hands out. and you just wait for God to drop you gold coins. And what I mean by that is you just wait for God to move in your life. And when he does something, and there's this thing called coronavirus on, we're supernatural people. We know he's got something going on, so we want to use it. We want to be involved in whatever he's got going on. So from today until next Wednesday, this is what I want you to do. We're going to do what I'm calling, we're going to write a rule like Edwards did. We're going to write a rule for our life. We're going to write some kind of Easter resolution. So we're going to take this time to reflect, and we're going to put some kind of challenge down for ourselves. We're going to do it to the end when coronavirus lifts and we meet again. So whatever, we're going to write some kind of rule for your life. I'm going to teach you what to do with this. Some kind of resolution for your life, something you want to do in this time so we can use coronavirus well. And then I want you to do it until this thing lifts. And so if that's a month, 45 days, 2 months, I have no idea. Until we gather again, I want you to write this rule this week. Take this week to look at it. Get the rule together. There's going to be some other cool things coming. So I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. So I want you to take this serious. Next week, think about the rule you want to make. I'm going to teach you how to do that in a second. And then at Wednesday, you can start pursuing that in your life. There's some kind of resolution, your Easter resolution, and then we'll go as a church. I'm going to do it. We're going to go until coronavirus lifts. So how do I do that? How do I make this resolution or this rule for my life? Because I want to grow in my relationship with the divine. I want to be able to reflect upon my personal issues and do this. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to look over. I'm going to give you a list of personal aspects that affect your relationship with God, and this is what I mean. Think about those 6 points, but think about these. These are personal aspects that affect your relationship with God. Time management. Write that down. Time management, huge personal aspect that affects your relationship with God. Relationships, it's another thing. Suffering, prayer, character, good works, health, and diet. I'm going to give them to you again. Time management, relationships, suffering, prayer, character, good works, health, and diet. So somewhere in that list of 7 things I gave you, everybody somewhere in there can find some kind of resolution that you want to make in that space. Maybe you need to be better at time management. Maybe there are some relationships that you have some time now to work on. I don't know. Maybe there's maybe that you're dealing with some kind of suffering and you want to think clearly about that, or you want to help someone that's suffering. Maybe you know someone that's suffering. I don't know. I'm just trying to think out loud. Prayer. Maybe you want to commit to a certain rhythm of prayer during this. Maybe there's some character issue you want to work on. Maybe you maybe there's some maneuver you need to make financially during this time. I don't know. Those are character moves. Good works. What's something small that you can carry out through all of this, or health and diet. You got nothing else to do but run or walk outside, so maybe there's a move that you need to make on that. So out of those 7 things, I gave you 6 things to reflect on, big rock things, but we're trying to get down to application. Out of those 7 things, reflect on where's the space in there where you can improve your relationship with God in those 7 things. Take the next week and figure that out, and then write a resolution about it. Write it down. Just say which one of these things resonates with me, and where do I want to improve, and write a resolution about it. And don't only write out the resolution, say I'm going to walk a mile a day or a mile every Tuesday for the next week until coronavirus lifts. If that's what you want to do, I'm just giving an example. I'm going to do that once every week until coronavirus lifts. My resolution is that I'm going to walk a mile every week, and that's what you're going to do. Write out the resolution, and then write out what hinders you from it. That's one thing. What is hindering you from it? And so this is the most important thing about this. We're not doing this because we're bored or we have free time. You need to remember up here what we're talking about. We're talking about, I want this to improve your relationship with God. I do. I want it to improve your relationship with God. The aim in it is not only write a resolution where you can improve, but you want to be thinking, how does this improve my relationship with God? That's the goal, okay? You need to keep that goal out in front of you. And then the second thing is, and that's really the main part of it, I wrote down on here that you want in general a better Christian life. You want to increase in godliness. You want to increase in godliness. You want to improve your relationship with the divine. And where in that can you write a resolution? Where in time management, relationships, suffering, prayer, character, good works, or health and diet, where in that space can you improve your relationship with God through a resolution? Write it this week, have it ready to go next Wednesday, and then we'll run together on this till the end of coronavirus. So appreciate you guys. Hope you enjoyed this. God bless you. We'll talk soon.